Dr. Maurice Rawlings was a cardiologist, a skeptic, a man who in 20 years of practice had seen so many deaths that he had stopped perceiving them as anything more than a medical event. In 1977, he was resuscitating a patient, a middle-aged man, cardiac arrest, standard procedure. He was performing chest compressions, pressing down on the sternum. And, between compressions, in those few seconds when the heart would start beating again and the patient would briefly regain consciousness before the next arrest, the man was screaming. Not from pain. Rawlings knew what screaming from pain looked like. This was different. The man was screaming that he was in hell, that it was dark, that there were creatures there, that he didn't want to go back. He was grabbing Rawlings by the hand and begging him not to stop. Literally, not to stop the chest compressions, because every time his heart stopped, he found himself there again. Rawlings resuscitated him. The patient survived, and a few hours later, when Rawlings came to his room to ask about what had happened, the man remembered nothing. Nothing at all. No hell, no creatures, no fear. As if nothing had happened. Rawlings stood by his bed and understood that what he had just witnessed, a man screaming between heartbeats that he was in hell, could not have been fabricated. Not a hallucination, not a side effect of medication. It was happening in real time, in the operating room, with a resuscitation team around him, in front of his eyes. He wrote a book, not a mystic, not a priest, a cardiologist with 20 years of experience. Wrote a book about what his patient saw between heartbeats, and in the process of writing it, discovered something that shook him more than the case itself. Most people who experience clinical death and find themselves in a dark place don't remember it after resuscitation, not a day later, not a week later, immediately. Rawlings began interviewing patients right after resuscitation, while they were still in the operating room, while they hadn't fully come to. And in that state, the percentage describing a dark, frightening experience was significantly higher than in studies where patients were interviewed days or weeks later. He arrived at a conclusion that overturned everything he understood about NDE research. We are systematically underestimating the number of negative near-death experiences because they disappear from memory faster than positive ones. And those who went through them often don't want to remember them themselves. Stay with me, because what Howard Storm and Howard Pittman described, two people with completely different backgrounds, independently of each other, overlaps in details too specific to be coincidence. Howard Storm was an art professor, an atheist, not simply someone who didn't think about religion, an active, convinced atheist who considered belief in God an intellectual weakness. In 1985 in Paris, he suffered a perforated stomach ulcer. He was dying in a French hospital while his wife searched for a translator to explain to the doctors what was happening. And here begins what he later described with the precision of a man trained to describe visual images. Professional, detailed, without any attempt to embellish. He left his body, found himself standing beside his own dying body, felt a presence, not saw, felt voices, friendly at first, inviting him to follow. He followed. The voices led him through a space that grew progressively darker, and at a certain point, the friendly tone disappeared. The voices changed, mocking, cruel, and around him, in the darkness, figures began to appear. He described them as beings that had once been human, not monsters from a horror film, something worse, because in them there was a recognizable human quality distorted beyond recognition. They began to beat him, to tear at him. He screamed, nobody heard. In desperation, a man who had spent his entire life rejecting the very existence of God cried out a prayer, not consciously, not from faith, from absolute desperation. The first words that came were a childhood prayer he hadn't thought of in decades, and in the moment he began to say it, the beings retreated, as if someone had switched on a light in a dark room. He described feeling a presence, enormous, warm, absolutely safe, that surrounded him, and a voice, not a sound and a direct transmission of meaning into his consciousness, which asked him, "Why did you call me?" "You never believed in me." Storm answered, "Because there was no one else to call." He came back. With a damaged stomach, the doctors addressed immediately, and with something else. The atheist art professor came back a different man. He became a minister, not gradually, not through a long path of doubt. He came back knowing he had to become a minister, because what he had seen in the darkness, and what he had felt when the darkness lifted, made any other choice impossible. Storm said something about his experience in hell that most retellings miss. He said the most terrifying thing there was not physical pain. The most terrifying thing was that the beings surrounding him had once been human, and what had happened to them had not happened because someone decided it from outside. It had happened because they had chosen, again and again through small choices over the course of a life, to become exactly that. Embittered, cruel, incapable of anything except causing pain. And this state, in the absence of a physical body that could distract from it, had become their only reality. Howard Pittman, a Baptist minister, 1979. Massive cardiac failure. Clinical death. What he described afterward differs sharply from most NDE accounts for one reason. He described not only what he saw, but a specific structure, levels, not metaphorically, literally levels he passed through one after another. The first level he described, closest to Earth, was populated by beings he identified as demonic. But the important detail in his description, these beings were not occupied with people who had already died. They were occupied with the living. He saw them interacting with the physical world, influencing thoughts, decisions, the behavior of people still alive, not through direct control, through suggestion, through prompting, through amplifying what was already in the person, fear, anger, envy, to a level at which the person begins to act from that place. The second level in his description was darker, more isolated. The beings there were not interacting with the living. There was something resembling a closed state, each being in its own reality built from its own nature, with no way out, no possibility of change, no time in the ordinary sense, only repetition of what already existed. Pittman described being led through these levels by a being, he identified it as an angel, that didn't explain what was happening but simply showed, silently, like a guide who knows that what is being seen is enough. Then, and this is the detail Pittman emphasized particularly, he was shown something he hadn't expected to see at all. He was shown his own life, not as condemnation, as a simple fact. He saw every moment when he could have helped and walked past, every moment when he could have said something important and stayed silent, every time his presence would have mattered to someone nearby, and he had been occupied with himself. And a voice, or transmission of meaning, he struggled with the precise description, asked him, "What have you done with what you were given?" Not an accusation, a question, but a question there was nowhere to escape from. Pittman came back and said afterward that what changed in him above all was not fear of hell as a place you can end up in. It was fear of living a life where at the end there would be no answer to that question. What have you done with what you were given? Now, what the researchers who spent decades studying NDE actually said about these experiences. And here it's important to say what is usually discussed less than the testimonies themselves. Raymond Moody, the man who introduced the very concept of NDE into scientific discourse, said in his later work that negative near-death experiences are significantly more common than is generally accepted. He estimated that between 15 and 20% of all NDE accounts contain elements of fear, darkness, or what people describe as hell. But most of those who went through such an experience don't speak about it publicly because they fear judgment, because they are ashamed, because the experience was so devastating they don't want to return to it, even in thought. Edgar Cayce spoke about this in several readings, and his formulation was one of the most specific of everything he said about what happens after death. He said that dark states after death are not a place someone sends a person to as punishment. They are a continuation of the state the person was in during life. A person who cultivated bitterness, cruelty, indifference to others during their life, does not end up in hell because someone decided that. They continue to exist in the state they created themselves, and that state, in the absence of a physical body that could distract from it, becomes their only reality. Michael Newton, across his thousands of regressions, did not describe a classical hell as a place of eternal punishment. But he described something that functions very similarly to what Storm and Pittman described. States in which a soul finds itself isolated in its own reality, built from its own nature, without the ability to interact with others, without forward movement, not because someone placed it there, but because it is itself unable to exit the loop it created during life. And here is what is the most important and the most uncomfortable conclusion from everything Rawlings, Storm, Pittman, Moody, Casey, and Newton said simultaneously. Hell is not a place to be feared because you can end up there accidentally or by someone else's decision. Hell is a state that is created during life through small choices, small decisions, small moments, when a person chooses bitterness over kindness, closure over openness, indifference over care. And death does not change this state automatically. It reveals it. It removes everything external, the body, the roles, the circumstances, and leaves only what the person created inside. Howard Storm, the atheist who screamed a childhood prayer in the darkness, said this directly in one interview. He said, "I don't think God sends people to hell. I think people create it themselves. One small choice at a time, and I know this not from theology. I know it because I saw the people who were there, and I saw exactly what they had become. Write in the comments, did what you heard today change anything in how you think about hell? And is there something in your life right now, a small choice, a small decision, that you make again and again, and that you yourself know you wouldn't want to bring with you there?"